Welcome to another Organization Unbound podcast. Back in 2012, we spoke with Aerin Dunford of the Berkana Institute about the organization's decision to go into an undefined period of hibernation. Given its focus on promoting living systems principles in social change work, we were curious to learn how it was putting these principles into practice internally. Berkana has recently re-emerged from hibernation, and so we followed up with Aerin to hear more about their experience. We were joined by Nicole Roux of I Am Somebody, a South African organization that runs Rites of Passage programs with young adults, and that has also been actively exploring themes of organizational hibernation, death, and renewal. Thank you, Aerin and Nicole, for coming together for this conversation. Aerin, in the podcast I did with you back in 2012, soon after the organization made the decision to hibernate, you spoke of several factors that brought you to that collective decision. One was a lack of coherence and connection amongst members and the work that people were doing, a feeling that the energy was depleting, both at an individual level and collectively. Also that you were feeling that you were, as a group, kind of working frantically without really knowing why exactly. A sense of being unclear about what the organization was calling to contribute to the world. You also spoke of some unhealthy patterns of relationships that had kind of developed over time, that you guys were feeling that a time of rest would help to kind of break those patterns. And I'm wondering how your experience of actually going through this period of hibernation has influenced those factors, if at all.
The first thing that comes to mind, I'll sort of start with the last thing you listed there, which is related to the relationships. Generally, the relationships have become much more distant. In some cases, people have stayed in contact and continued to collaborate, but basically we sort of, as a group, stopped having any kind of regular contact. And I think that has been quite healthy. I feel that it gave us the opportunity to, more on an individual, like one-on-one basis, re-explore what was really there. And then those relationships that maybe didn't feel like they had a lot of traction or purpose or meaning or fulfillment, they kind of, went away. And I think that was needed. On the flip side, coming out of this 5 to 6 month period of crossing the T's and dotting the I's, we formed a small board. So there were 4 of us. And our relationships became, over the course of these 3 years, very, very close. And we really found in each other this space of just solidarity and connection and support, but without a lot of focus on output or creating something together or doing a project together. And it took some time to get into that rhythm, but it created a different level and a different kind of relationship. We think those spaces of just coming together and being in solidarity are kind of what's needed in our busy world today. Meg Wheatley, as some of you might know, about 4 or 5 years ago, she began to do 3-month silent meditation retreats in the winter. And for a while, people thought, oh, that's so great that you take care of yourself and that you go and you do these things. And now she's really starting to put a stake in the ground and say, this isn't about me taking care of myself or resting. These meditation retreats are my work. It is essential that I go into this phase of silence and introspection in order for me to do what I do the rest of the year. And so that was really needed in order to shift my perspective about Berkana. And I noticed as, we started to talk about maybe coming back, out into the world, that sometimes that would cause some concern or tension in me. Because I didn't want to go back to that phase where I felt like so burdened by the work. We've created something that doesn't require all of that infrastructure and centralized responsibility. So truly creating something that's self-organized.
I'm thinking about what you were talking about, the silent meditation or retreat as being silent for 3 months. I'm wondering about different practices that you might have and other people who are now making up Berkana, in kind of that stepping away, or if something changed for you in creating that reflection now as you go back into the work.
I think that, our practice was really coming together on these Skype calls every few months, and that was kind of the only practice. So for me, not having to have an agenda for these calls was so liberating. The business part of it took probably about a fourth of the time, and then we often just spent time kind of reflecting together on what we were seeing in the world, what we were experiencing in other work we were doing. And then little by little, that led us to begin reflecting on the space that we had created over these years together. And that's where we started to get the idea of what we wanted to offer to others. So this is this very small experiment that we've come back with in just this past March called Gathering Friends. And it's really just based on our experience as a board. And it was a perfect example of expressive change, learning from the inside out. Based on our experience, we created something that we birthed through Berkana and offered to others. So being really attentive to what's happening in the period of reflection, rest, and hibernation is important. It's not just going to sleep and being unconscious.
It's leading me into another question just around structure that I've been thinking about a lot as we've kind of put the organization, I Am Somebody, through a Rites of Passage. What is enough structure now with your reorganizing and the different way that you're approaching things?
We've really kept the structure to the bare minimum because one of the challenges that I at least feel that we faced when we made the decision to go into hibernation was having created a structure, and I would say an infrastructure, that was pretty complicated. Relatively speaking, it's not complicated. I think that at our maximum, we were a staff of like maybe 8 or 9 people with a couple of offices and, some expenses. But even that, became hard to maintain financially and in terms of energy as well. And so I think it's very important that the structure respond to what is needed within the organization, and that through that sense of awareness and paying attention, we create something, and then from that, the structure should arise, not the other way around.
I think in a way this is a pioneering way to work, and that the legal structures and the way that the kind of general mindset of the industrial age hasn't caught up with that yet. And so those of us that are working in organizations are trying to listen to our intuition and really practice that collective intuition. We're not, we're running up against a whole history of being an organization that was totally counter to that. So, yeah, it's hard.
And I've been wondering about, because we're working with living and dying, the point of Rites of Passage is to prepare yourself for when you actually die, and just to be aware that there's death all the time in our life. And I've been wondering about organizations and our kind of the relationship that we have in the sector with talking about dying of parts of organizations or of organizations, and that whole thing of failure and silences and all of that, and how that might relate to or just be really similar to how we are with death in general in a lot of societies. Someone said to me, it's, if it does die, maybe it's great practice for dying.
I think you hit the nail on the head with this idea of failure. That in our kind of Western way of thinking about life and death, we don't often take it into account, that our death could very well become the fertile compost for whatever is next to be born. And that maybe by not organizations or part of our organization to die, we are preventing that. The role of ego in our ability or lack thereof to be conscious to what is wanting to happen in an organization. And as I look back, I think about the configuration of the people who were present in Berkana, and we all have, our dreams and our ambitions and our ideas of what we can make happen through organization. But if what we want is really getting in the way and blinding, some more collective intelligence coming from within the organization, there can be some pretty challenging moments, because we're really attached to our ideas about what's possible through us and through us as part of this organization.
So linked to that, I'm curious what actually sparked the decision to reemerge.
When we imagined how this process would be, we said, okay, we're going to go into this hibernation. No idea how long it will last. It will last as long as it needs to last. And when we start to feel like maybe there's a need or clarity around purpose for Berkana again, we said we were going to engage in this kind of listening out activity. We have a really wide net and vast community of people who care and are interested in Berkana. So I kind of figured it would be like interviews and talking to people about what they were noticing in the world. And over the course of these 3 years, it actually evolved into a listening in experience rather than a listening out. We had discussed the possibility of reaching out to people, and each time we had the conversation, it didn't really sit. It didn't really feel right. And then about a year ago, we had a call, and we just took a second to like step back and really reflect on the space of these board interactions that we had over the course of the previous 2 years. And that was when we started to acknowledge that maybe this experience we had could be of use or service to others. And that was how we started to conceive of the idea of coming back into the world. And I guess for me, the biggest learning was just this idea of having a sense of clarity when we went into hibernation about how this was going to look, that we were going to rest, and then we were going to do listening out, and then we were going to create something that then responded to what we heard from all these people, and kind of a very academic, like research-based approach. And what ended up happening was an entirely different experience, process, result. So just unhooking ourselves from a very common organizational mindset, that says we have a goal and then we lay out all of these steps to reach that goal. This was just much more emergent.
Well, and it might be different. Berkana is an organization that is working at the kind of upper levels of social change, whereas if you have an organization working on the ground and their hibernation means tons of people are going to not get their medication, or there's certain things to think about.
Yeah, there wasn't any immediate impact. It was a challenge for some people, but it wasn't like people weren't getting fed or they didn't have a roof over their head because of that. And I've not considered it before, what it might look like for an organization that really does that on the ground kind of work to go through a transition like this. I don't know. It feels like it's really important to make the point that even though we were looking in through a lens of our experiences out in the world. If we kind of believe in a systems theory perspective, we can trust that the experience that we're having out in the world probably is shared by others. There's also a piece in there, and this is also related to our long-term vision, is just staying in this unknown and not having attachment to a lot of expectations about how it needs to look, and that's hard for us, especially those of us that have been in the sector of nonprofit work for a long time. We really have been taught to look for impact and look for results, and funders often demand that kind of information.
It feels like what you were saying now changes the meaning of resilience. It's not this kind of like get up every time you fall down thing, but actually what is it that emerges, and how does that change over time and kind of continue to emerge and continue to become something new, and it's a different kind of sustainability.
There's a key distinction in there for me about how we carry on and carry on. Meg has been really connected to this concept of persevering, that we stay and we stay. So there's a piece of it that has to do with endurance, but it's not just staying with the same energy or the same intention, or just, doing the same thing over and over because that is what we do, without that sense of presence and awareness and looking around to see what's happening. We may transform as we stay if we're paying attention,
Well, and it seems like what you're really talking about in terms of sustainability is to sustain the capacity to pay attention. That's what you need to sustain, right? And the capacity to ask questions that will lead you to the right action for you and for the organization.
I kind of ask myself now, looking back, like, what was lost? What did we lose by going in hibernation? And I think that that's a good question as well. And I've had some moments of thinking, like, I would really like to more actively try to heal some of the relationships that were damaged in the process. And I've been pushed, by my fellow board members just to let time heal things. And so it's been a really good exercise for me personally, and just like trusting that, with time and with a clear intention of healing, even if nothing happens outwardly, that those things can be released.
Is there anything that you realized about relationships, in giving it that space and continuing now to give it that space, even though it's challenging?
Hindsight is 2020, but if there's a way, to be more forthright and really bring to the surface and name what's going on in the moment, obviously I think that could have helped. There were a lot of dynamics going on under the surface that weren't explicit. I think it's all about the container that we create within our organizations, so obviously a lot of this stuff seems very self-evident, but it's harder to live it in the day-to-day. So just creating a space to talk about the interpersonal piece of all of the work that we do organizationally. And of course, like, we bring that in, when we do a check-in circle, or we talk about what's going on in our personal lives. But often we kind of avoid the conversations that have to do more with the interpersonal dynamics. You kind of have to figure it out for yourself and your own organization, what that looks like. I don't think that there's kind of like a cookie cutter answer to that question, unfortunately. But you have to create the space for it. That much I'm sure of.
There was an organization that I came across that had a weekly gathering where they had no agenda, no framing question, nothing. And it's just a space where you can bring things that you wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable bringing into any of the other spaces.
Yeah, I think that we really need more spaces without agendas, because something about the pressure of getting all these things checked off of our list, in a board meeting, or I think that all of that pressure and that kind of fullness doesn't allow the space, for these other kinds of issues to emerge, and it doesn't really allow new things to pop up.
Aerin, was there anything that you wanted to share that maybe we didn't ask, or is there anything else that is sitting with you?
We probably don't have time, but I was really interested to hear a little bit from Nicole, your decision of I Am Somebody, Rites of Passage, and what's going to stay alive and how. I'd love to hear that.
Cool. Some months ago, I came to the personal realization of needing to change my role, and then the organization went through a process as a result, and we used the 4 Shields tool, which we use in our Rites of Passage work. It's kind of that cycle of life and death, the 4 cardinal points, and each one is a metaphor for a stage of life. So we looked in the South at what wants to live, and we did this as a process with community and the board. What wants to live, and then in the West, what wants to die, and then in the North, what wants to hibernate, and in the East, what wants to be born. And out of that, it became really clear that people want the community piece to continue, and the long-term relationships, and sitting in circle, sharing stories, which is a lot of the work we do. So we're continuing that piece. And it feels like there isn't that kind of stress with people around organizing story circles or organizing short rites of passages. It's not the same as the program kind of burden feeling. It felt like as long as we were talking about an NPO, people got nervous about all the stuff that had to happen. And it just felt like, in a way, the only way we could really have some kind of rebirth is if we don't have that feeling of burden. And if we really allow a big part of the work to close. So we made that decision. And then the rebirth, the kind of what wants to be born, we looked at a lot of the young people in our work wanted to be trained in the tools we're using. And I think that's going to kind of come together with the story circles and the rites of passage. Yeah, and then hibernating our program, which is kind of just feeling out for when or where it can continue. And I don't know, how soon that would be, but I think at some point that will probably happen. But I guess one of the questions now is how to allow the process going forward to emerge. And not to control it too much, but also there needs to be structure to some extent, and kind of the reactions to the closing of the NPO, and can you continue with work when people are having those reactions? And I think a lot of that is just the emotional, the fears and all the stuff that's in this period.
I just encourage you to kind of give it time and let it settle and be aware. It's interesting to me, this theme of burden, like this, that seems to be something that is tying these two experiences together.
And I think also just that moving between what we personally need and what the organization needs, and how organizations can allow individuals to do both. Yeah, but I also want to say thank you to you and to everyone else who's been involved in the process, because it really helped us to read your letter that you sent and to listen to the podcast, and it was really helpful in broadening the way we looked at what was possible. So really, thank you.
Thanks, Aerin. I hope we can have a conversation at some point that doesn't necessarily involve us talking about organizational life.
That would be great, Anna. So nice to meet you, Nicole, and best of luck with everything. And I hope to be in touch with you both in the future. Take care.
Bye. This podcast was brought to you by Organization Unbound. Thank you for listening, and we invite you to visit us at organizationunbound.org.